Now, could the UK possibly be moving against Brexit? Joining me is Matt Singh of Number Cruncher Analytics and Lord Hayward, who's also an election analyst. Now, Matt, you have just done a poll regarding Brexit in a sort of hypothetical 2020 scenario. Just give us the lowdown on that poll.
Right, so what we did, it's a new methodology that really tries to get to the bottom of some of the difficulties that polling's been having recently. So it's an online poll that partly uses conventional online panels, although carefully selected panels, and try to get less politically engaged people and get a more representative sample. And then there's also another technique involved called river sampling, where essentially we take people that are not in panels, so intercepting people on websites, for example, and giving them surveys, recruiting people from social media, for example, and really trying to get hold of the sort of people who aren't necessarily going to want to join panels and to get a really good sample.
And the question posed to them in terms of 2020 was along the lines of, it's 2020, Brexit has happened, it's been delivered.
Yeah.
Would you want to go back in, stay out? And that's
yeah.
roughly the question posed.
Roughly, yes. So it was, should Britain join the EU or should Britain not join the EU? And 47% of people said Britain should not join the EU. 31% said Britain should join, and the other 22% were undecided. And the really interesting thing comes when you look into the detail of who was saying what. So in general, people who voted to leave the EU in 2016 would be very much against rejoining. It was sort of 85%, I think, who would not want to join, and only 4% who would. So they would be the sort of regretters, so to speak. But among Remain voters, and particularly Conservatives, people who voted Conservative in 2017 and had voted Remain in 2016, among those there's a much lower, smaller appetite to go back into the EU than there is not to among leavers.
So in a way, there's less Remoaners than perhaps has been spoken.
Yes.
I mean, that's quite an interesting point when you reflect on the current news in terms of a Remain, or at least a softer Brexit, people's vote kind of style campaigning. We hear of millions of pounds being set up and campaign groups and influencers getting together in European Institute buildings in London and plotting their X, Y, Z. And yet, supposedly, I think it was Remain voters 61%, 16% opposed. I mean, it's quite a significant number who have accepted Brexit and staying out.
I fall into that category. I voted Remain. I'm convinced that that is what the country should have done. But I've accepted the position that the decision was taken at the referendum. I'm not an advocate of a second referendum. And I cannot entertain the thought that we would be in negotiations to go back in 2020. And I know lots of people who fall into that category. They are generally Remainers, not necessarily Conservatives, but they've just accepted the position that unfortunately we've decided to leave, we are going to leave, and certainly 2020 would be far too soon to make a judgment.
There is, to some extent, some expected results, perhaps. I mean, Leave voters 84%. Let's stay out. And then you've got stuff for people in North of England, 53%, non-grads, 53%, Tory voters, 71%, over 65, 64%. I mean, there are some, 51% for male takers of the poll. And then, of course, 18 to 24-year-olds, 42, Lib Dem voters, 50%. There is some expectations here. Interesting about the Lib Dems, though, is that there seems to still be quite a large number of people who would, at 2020, still want to go back into the EU, and yet the only party who's really committing wholeheartedly to the European project still hovers around, 7% at the moment? Not able to cut through on that message.
Yeah, I mean, in this same poll, we asked for voting intention. We had the Lib Dems on 8%, which is basically where they've been for the last 8 years. Really, since the immediate aftermath of the 2010 election, they've basically been in the high single digits. I mean, in terms of why that party's not making progress, despite there obviously being some degree of enthusiasm for either stopping or softening Brexit, is that partly because they're not the official third party anymore, they don't get the same airtime, they don't get the same sort of questioning time, they're simply don't have the visibility that they would have done pre-2015. But also, I think, as much as there are some very strong advocates of softening or stopping Brexit, a lot of them are also passionate supporters of other parties, particularly Labour. So, I mean, there you can obviously see another point, of course, on that is that there are far fewer by-elections now, and in the past the Lib Dems and the SDP before them used to get a lot of headlines from these stonking great by-election wins. So things, on the one hand, you might look at the fundamentals and think, yes, they should be good for a Lib Dem recovery, but other factors are sort of working the opposite way, so it is quite hard for them.
Well, one thing that is interesting is obviously Leave voters fairly resolute in their decision the way they voted. Remain voters, certainly not as strong in terms of staying or wanting to go back into the EU. The idea of in terms of the airtime, how this is reflected in the media, you wouldn't ever get the sense that that is the case. These numbers are the true, and I suppose in an area of speculation, there is such thing as a shy Tory phenomenon. Is there such thing as a sort of shy Brexiteer phenomenon in the sense of...
No, I think this is a London phenomenon. When I forecast that the referendum would go against the Remainers, I was told by the media, by the civil service, by the London-based politicians that I was wrong. What they'd failed to do was to recognise the mood beyond the M25. And we're back in the same position. You've got people like Tony Blair saying we must change this decision. You referred to the £50 million being made available. It's very much a London syndrome, which is not a reflection of the country at large.
Which is interesting in the way that the Brexit vote itself was a shock to the system and a total opening up of the revelation of the London thinking versus the rest of the country, and yet, in a way, as really what your poll indicates is that there is a massive disconnect between what the facts are and at least what the perception being portrayed is. Which is
yeah, I mean, there's certainly. We asked in the poll how people voted in the referendum. This is not pass vote weighted, but we got back basically 52-48. So there doesn't seem to be any sign of any shyness there. But I think in terms of the London effect, I mean, what we've really seen, I mean, until 1992, London voted the way the rest of the country did, and since then you've seen often with these sort of a lot of graduate jobs in London, so you've seen a massive drop in the average age in London relative to the rest of the country. You've seen a lot more graduates. The ethnic diversity has increased a lot, and also in the past in London, where you had a lot of the sort of Thatcherite right to buyers, they're now right to buy landlords with renters living there. And one of the other things I've uncovered recently is that a big part of the story of the 2017 election was people who rent rather than own their homes swinging against the Conservatives and also increasing in turnout.
Yeah, fascinating poll. Lord Hayward, Matt Singh, thank you very much for coming on.